I just got out of the afternoon class and a student asked me a question but also had to run off to catch the shuttle. So I found the question they were talking about. Before I get into this, let me just take this opportunity to just encourage you guys, anytime you come up with a weird question, something that confuses you or you have questions about from your homework, absolutely bring it into class. This is a great way for us to get some discussions going in class because your classmates have seen something similar. So let's take a look at the question. I'm 80% sure the student was looking at this question. They had this question and they weren't sure what the answer was supposed to be. So let me walk through what we've got here and explain along the way. So, suppose Sam, an economist from a business administration program in Georgia, and Teresa, another economist from a university in Florida, are both guests on a popular science podcast. The host of the podcast is facilitating their debate over budget deficits. The following dialogue represents a portion of the transcript of their discussion. All right, so we got a podcast debate between a couple economists. Teresa says, most people recognize that the budget deficit has been rising considerably over the last century. That is something that we can verify pretty quickly. Fred St. Louis budget deficit. The Federal's, what's the name of it? Federal Reserve Economic Data, FRED, from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. When you Google Fred St. Louis, you will come up with stuff from this data set. And if we look at the federal surplus or deficit, we can see that it is just absolutely astonishing. The last 20 years, the federal deficit has been absolutely bananas. So at the end of Bill Clinton's term, there was a surplus, but that was absolutely a rarity, right? So the end of the 90s, little surplus. Through the 90s and the 80s, we're running a deficit. Through the 70s, we're running a deficit. Through the 60s, we have a tiny surplus in 1969, right? That was 69 until 99. It was all deficit in between. All deficit, little surplus in 1960, 1957. So basically in the last 70 years, we've had a surplus like 3 or 4 years and barely. And when we look at the overall story, the deficit is enormous. So here we get the war in Iraq, right? So if you're going to run a war on terror, that's going to be enormous. And then we get the bailouts after the Great Recession in 2009. That was enormous. Both were unprecedented expansions in the deficit. And then it just stayed gigantic. And then we had COVID. And then another enormous deficit. And we're still running an unprecedentedly large deficit. So, most people recognize the budget deficit has been rising considerably, I would say over the last 20 years. But over the last century, absolutely. With just a wild increase in the last 20 years. Sorry, I got distracted. Teresa says, we need to find the best course of action to remedy this situation. Sam says, I believe a cut in income taxes would boost economic growth and raise tax revenue enough to reduce budget deficits. We'll talk about this in class, but this is the idea of the Laffer curve. The idea is that if your taxes are really high, people don't work hard, so you don't get much tax revenue. If your taxes are 100%, nobody's going to work. You're going to collect zero taxes. If you lower your tax rate, you're going to increase your tax revenue. But if we're starting at a low tax rate already, to get more tax revenue, you have to raise the tax rate. Just like anything, there's a trade-off, and you can go too far. But Sam is arguing that we are on the right side of the Laffer curve, that if we cut our tax rate, we could actually raise more tax revenue. That's what Sam is saying. Teresa says, I feel that raising the top income tax rate would reduce the budget deficit more effectively. So Sam says, let's cut taxes, let the economy grow, and then the taxes collected on a bigger pie will offset the cuts. And Teresa doesn't feel that that's the case. So the question is, what sort of a disagreement are they having? Is it due to differences in values, difference in scientific judgments, or differences between perception versus reality? Well, this is, I don't know. I don't even know where to go with that. But these first two, these are corresponding with the idea of a positive disagreement and a normative disagreement. So neither of them is saying anything contradictory in terms of values. They both are effectively agreeing that it's a good idea to reduce the budget deficit. Not everyone agrees, but in this little snippet, they both seem to be on the same page that the goal is good, but they disagree about how to get to that goal. So it's not a difference in value, it's a difference in what they think the state of the world is. Sam thinks we're on the right side of the Laffer curve, Teresa thinks we're on the left side. That doesn't mean that they have different values, that they think that one thinks one thing is important, the other thinks something else is more important. It just means that they are at a disagreement as to what would be the effect if we did something. Something specifically about the tax rate. So, the next part, despite their differences, with which proposition are two economists chosen at random most likely to agree? Rent ceilings reduce the quality and quantity of available housing. That is something that certainly I agree with as an economist, and I think that most economists who teach supply and demand are going to agree that there is something to that. Having a single income tax rate would improve economic performance. There are economists who believe this. There are economists who disagree. I don't have a dog in that race. I think it's easy to say that it's not something where we choose two economists at random and they're most likely to agree. They're more likely to agree on this than this, is my educated guess. And immigrants receive more in government benefits than they contribute in taxes. This is a pretty easy empirical question, and the data show that immigrants tend to contribute more in taxes than they receive. Of course, it's going to be different if you look at different segments, but if you think about like illegal immigrants, they pay into Social Security and they do not expect to get that money out. If we start talking about roads, it's more difficult, right? But if we chose two economists at random, okay, MindTap is telling me this isn't right. But I think that given the question, rent ceilings reduce the quantity and quality of available housing. That's a pretty non-controversial statement to make to an economist. Immigrants receive more in government benefits than they contribute. That could be different at different times. So that's something where the last I looked at this data, which was a while ago, it was sort of the opposite of what this statement is saying, but that could change. It could be different under different circumstances. And then the single income tax, economists like to think about what would be the ideal income tax system, but they're not going to agree on what it would be. All right, so some interesting questions. The second one is a little tougher because we're asking about what do economists think, and you guys aren't yet economists. But there are things that economists definitely do agree on, and in the textbook, Mankiw talks about some of these. This one, I think, was what the student was having a more difficult time with. If you try and Google differences in values, you're not going to find anything because it's not jargon, or differences in scientific judgment. The jargony way of saying these, the ways that if you Googled the term, you would find the answer is, this is a positive analysis, this is a normative analysis. They agree on the positive analysis that there is a big budget deficit, but they disagree in the positive analysis of what would be the impact of raising or lowering tax rates on taxes actually collected. And it could go either way. There is room for disagreement, at least until you've seen the data, right? This is a question where we could say, okay, for 2021, it looks like this. It might be different next year, but in any case, what we're looking at here is they are expecting different things of the world, even though they agree on the basic goal of reducing the budget deficit being a sensible idea. All right, once again, if you bring these up in class, this is great. Of course, it's hard to bring up in class since we don't have a functioning projector, but if you bring in your laptop or you send me a screenshot or whatever, it's still something we can talk about in class. That one person has a question is good evidence that probably someone else in the class also has a question about the same concept. So hopefully that was helpful for this student and for others. And if you have any other questions, ask in the usual places, and I will talk to you in the future.